The year is 2012 when a saturation diver gets trapped 3,000 feet deep at the bottom of the sea while repairing oil rig pipes. The story shifts to Chris Lemon's 2 months before the accident as he listens to a radio report about an approaching storm set to hit Aberdeen, Scotland. Chris, a rookie but talented diver who works at Bibby Offshore, informs his fiancée, Morag, that he will be away for a month, having been selected as a saturation diver. Morag is uneasy about his job, knowing the risks involved. To reassure her, Chris insists that he will be fine. At Aberdeen Harbor, Chris boards the dive support vessel, DSV, and is greeted by his superior, Craig, and fellow diver, Duncan, who mentions that they will have a new captain this time. As the crew prepares the ship to sail, Craig briefs them on their mission. He explains that they will be living in what he calls a tin can, a pressurized living chamber, for 28 days. They will be pressurized to 300 feet, about 90 meters, where they will work on replacing a section of the gas pipeline. Once the job is complete, they will undergo a 4-day decompression process before returning to normal atmospheric pressure. Craig divides the crew into 3 teams. Chris, Duncan, and a seasoned diver named Dave are assigned to Team A. Chris has heard of Dave's exceptional reputation, but has never worked with him personally. Dave, however, seems distant. Duncan, good-natured as always, teases Dave for acting standoffish around Chris. Dave, always focused on work, questions Chris's track record. Duncan vouches for him, explaining that Chris worked as a deckhand for 3 years before getting a shot as a diver. Since then, he has completed 5 dives alongside Duncan. Later, as the team settles into their bunks, Dave notices Chris placing a photo of Morag beside his bed. Offering his advice, Dave tells Chris that once he's in the water, he needs to stay focused and not let thoughts of the outside world distract him. Duncan, however, reassures Chris, playfully mentioning that Dave himself is a softie with 2 kids. With all teams accounted for, their chamber doors are sealed, and Craig initiates the gas pressurization process. Meanwhile, the boat heads toward the Huntington oil field. The crew monitors the operation, and Craig turns off the gas compression. Over the radio, Craig reminds the team not to leave the chamber before decompression, warning that the gas saturating their bodies could cause severe injury. Duncan jokes that he says that every time. During a quiet meal, Duncan reveals that he was let go by Bibby Offshore. To lighten the mood, Dave jokes that their job will probably be fully automated in 10 years. Chris suggests Duncan should go into management like Craig, but Duncan says he isn't interested. He tells Dave honestly that he's a good diver and doesn't need him anymore. Early the next morning, Chris receives a video message from Morag detailing their wedding plans and telling him to have fun with Duncan. After giving the boat coordinates to Marine Control, the captain is informed that the approaching storm may be stronger than expected. Craig reassures him that they are in the North Sea, far from the storm's impact zone. Once the dynamic positioning system, DPS, is confirmed active, allowing the ship to hold position without an anchor, the captain gives Craig the go-ahead to start the dive operation. Craig informs the team, and they begin donning their diving suits, complete with flares, a knife, and a compass for extra precautions. Before entering the diving bell, Dave tells Chris to be careful and follow his lead. Team A reaches the diving bell, which slowly descends to 300 feet. Upon arrival, Craig announces they have reached depth. Duncan connects Dave's helmet to an umbilical cord, which supplies his oxygen and communications, and secures it onto his head. Dave then dives into the water, with Chris following shortly after. However, as Chris submerges, he becomes nervous and breathes heavily until Dave reassures him. Once the ship drops the power cable, the divers begin work. After connecting the cable, they activate the manifold and report back to Craig. Everything runs smoothly until Chris checks the gas readings inside the manifold and notices they are too high. As he works to fix it, the crew suddenly realizes the ship's thrusters have gone offline, meaning they have lost the ability to hold position. The tide gets choppy as the wind blows heavily. Sensing something is wrong, Dave notices the ship is drifting and quickly orders Chris to move away from the manifold. On board, the DPS completely fails and the crew loses control of the boat. Craig orders Duncan to abort the mission and instructs him to give the divers as much umbilical slack as possible. As Dave and Chris climb onto the manifold to get better visibility, they cannot spot the bell, and Chris's umbilical snags on the manifold. With the ship tilting because of the wind and the power cable detaching, the seabed plunges into darkness. The team also finds out their ship is not drifting, as Chris's cord is acting as an anchor attached to the structure. Dave tries to reach Chris but can't, and Chris's oxygen supply is running low. Dave urgently tells him to switch to his backup oxygen. Duncan informs Craig that Chris is on bailout, meaning he has only 10 minutes of air left. Dave warns Chris that his umbilical will snap, pulling him away from the structure. He instructs Chris to get back to the manifold so he can find him again. Before Chris can respond, his cord snaps and he is dragged into the dark water. Back on the ship, Craig reports that they have lost visual on the divers. However, their ROV, remotely operated vehicle, captures video footage of Dave returning to the bell. Upon reaching safety, Dave reports that Chris is gone, his cord was severed. Meanwhile, Chris ignites a flare and tries calling Duncan and Craig over the comms but receives no response. Remembering Dave's instructions, he realizes he must get back to the manifold. The captain is informed that the thrusters are working but the DPS remains down. Despite concerns about manual control in rough tides, he and his first officer decide to navigate the ship manually to prevent drifting further from Chris's last known position. After much effort, they manage to turn the boat. The DPO officer reports that they are 630 feet away from the dive site. Meanwhile, Chris reaches the manifold and collapses onto it, thinking about Morag. The DPO officer suggests resetting the DPS, but the captain refuses since it would take hours. He insists they find another solution. Finally, the ROV locates the manifold and spots Chris lying on top of it, convulsing. Craig assumes the movements are involuntary spasms and that Chris is dead. The DPO officer informs the captain that he has found a workaround. Since the DPS operates through a startup CPU, he can rewire it to bypass the startup delay. However, it poses a risk. The captain tells him to go ahead with it. Meanwhile, Craig orders his colleague to retrieve Chris using the ROV, but he warns that it's too risky. Determined, Craig operates the ROV himself. After a tense struggle, he finally tethers Chris onto the ROV, but Craig discovers that Chris has clipped himself onto the structure, likely to avoid being swept away by the tide. Craig is impressed by Chris's quick thinking but frustrated by the situation. Back in the dive bell, Duncan tells Dave that he and Chris first met during a rescue dive operation. He recalls how, during that mission, they failed to recover one of the bodies from a sunken ship and were only able to return the victim's belongings. Duncan vows that this time, he will not return just Chris's belongings to Morag, he will bring Chris back alive. The DPO officer successfully rewires the system, bringing the DPS back online. With the ship now stable, the crew prepares to retrieve Chris. Duncan is informed that Chris is still on the manifold. Dave dives back into the water, spotting Chris lying on top of the manifold. He retrieves him, but as he tries to climb back up, Chris's weight slows him down. After a strenuous effort, Dave manages to bring Chris back into the bell. Craig immediately begins mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, but Chris appears unresponsive and glassy. He has been without oxygen for over 30 minutes. Just as the crew loses hope, Chris suddenly gasps for air, stunning everyone. The entire crew erupts in celebration. Due to the ordeal, the captain decides to cut the rotation short, and the team heads home. On day 1 of decompression, Chris confides in Dave that while he was down there, he felt a strange sense of peace. However, he was overcome with sadness, feeling like he had let Morag down. He thanks Dave for saving his life. On day 3, after bidding farewell to the team, Chris shares the incident with Morag, who is shaken by the near tragedy. He reassures her, promising that no matter what happens, he will always find his way back to her. And with that, the story ends.